Well, hi there. We're here in the chaplain's office today with the Reverend Dr. Stephen Long. Steve Long is the Carrie M. McGuire University Professor of Ethics here at SMU. And Steve and I have known each other for a while, and I'm really looking forward to these few minutes of conversation. We want to talk about justice, and I'd like to know what Steve thinks about this term. So let's start with this question. How did you get interested in the topic of justice, and what direction does your advocacy take?
Right. Thanks, Steve, for the invitation to be here and to speak about justice. I think my first real concern with justice occurred when I went to Honduras to be a local preacher in the British Methodist conference there, which was the Caribbean Council of Methodist Churches. And I preached in 12 different churches on 3 little islands. And in the evening, I would often give the women who were working at the local lobster and shrimp plant a ride in the boat from the island to island. They worked anywhere from 6 to 10 hours a day at very low wages. And by the time they had taken the lobster and shrimp from the waters of Honduras and prepared it for sale in the global market, they could no longer afford it. And I worshipped with these women. I prayed with these women. I preached to many of them, and some of them were preachers as well. My wife ran a medical clinic, and we saw the difficult health conditions under which people lived. And it seemed like there was plenty of wealth, but it was just the way it was being, the way it came together, that somehow they didn't have access to their own wealth. And it certainly wasn't that they weren't hardworking, because my lands, a few people I knew worked as hard as they did. Now at that time I was just interested in maybe going to medical school or seminary. I wasn't sure, but that stuck with me. I hadn't read Karl Marx, I hadn't read Adam Smith, I didn't know the first thing about economics. But that concrete, practical reality made me think that something wasn't just right in the world. You know, to quote Shakespeare, time is out of joint. There's this thing where you just begin to get this sense of unease, as if this kind of reality would not be pleasing to God. As a Methodist preacher and as someone interested in theology at the time, it struck me as a question of justice. So that really animated my concerns for justice. I then went to seminary, still thinking I might go to medical school, but I just never got around to that, and studied theology and loved theology. And that question, why is the world this way, stayed with me through all those years.
So that leads to a question about how you understand justice. You know, there are a number of ways of thinking about that concept and its value. And so how would you describe that term? Right.
Yeah, and that's complicated, isn't there? There are probably several shelves in the library of books which simply try to define what justice is. To be simplistic, let me suggest that there are 2 main ways we think about justice. One, we think about justice as a procedure, as a formal account of what fairness requires, independent of who the subject or agent is. It's a very common account of justice, especially in liberal democratic theory, where you have something like John Rawls' original position, and you assume everyone is in the same situation, or everyone could be in the same situation, behind a veil of ignorance. And then you ask, well, if we were in that circumstance, if we were in that condition, how would we want the world to be structured? And so then we come up with procedures of fairness, of opportunity, and of rights, and we try to mitigate against any sort of injustice that might occur. And that has some usefulness to it. I don't mean to discount it. One of the difficulties I have with that is how ahistorical it is. That is to say, why would those of us, especially those of us who are privileged, why would we ever want to go behind a veil of ignorance and sort of, why arrive at that? How do you arrive at that original position? So it's really unclear to me that attends to the question of justice. It may have some usefulness in terms of the way we think about structuring political life, but I'm not sure it really gets at what we mean by justice. Now, another way to think about justice is to think of it in terms of both the theological and philosophical tradition that understands justice as a virtue. And justice as a virtue assumes that it's not simply a procedure or a form, but it's something you have to learn to cultivate over time, primarily by knowing what you owe to whom. And that's going to differ in certain circumstances. So this is contrary to the original position in the veil of ignorance. This assumes you have to have these relationships. And for instance, the justice I owe to my wife is not the same as the justice I owe to you. Or the justice I owe to my children is not the same as the justice I owe to your children. As a teacher, there's virtues of justice that I owe to my students, and likewise they owe to me. And all of these are going to have to be understood within the context of the relationships that determine our lives, that are already in place. And it also means we've inherited histories which put us in different relationships that have to be attended to. In that sense, justice depends upon a variety of contexts. And it's never something that you always, it's not something that you can just simply give a definition to and know what you're talking about.
You've been working in the academy for a long time, and you know about the sort of the competing understandings of justice in the academy. Taking that second approach that you mentioned, how do you approach this as a professor, where you want to help students grapple with these questions and maybe instill some of those virtues in them? Given the diversity of thinking perhaps about justice, or diversity of assumptions about justice, how do you suggest going at it?
That's where it gets really complicated. When I teach undergraduates ethics, I often begin by asking them if they know the various ethical theories. If their parents sat them down when they were 6 or 7 and said, here, be a deontologist or a utilitarian. And I'm grateful that I've never had a student who said, yes, my parents did that to me. It would be a terrible thing to do to your child. And then I ask them, well, how do you have ethics then? Do you have any ethics? And they all think they have ethics, but they don't have a theory about their ethics. And I think that's right. And then you ask them, well, where did your ethics come from? And then they begin to say things like church, synagogue, family, school, learning how to play a sports on a sports team, learning how to be a member of the symphony. And as you begin to explore, you realize, of course, you've already had a moral formation. And of course, in that very activity, you learned what obligations you have to whom and how you have to go about fulfilling them. It's present. It's there, tacitly. So one of the things I try to do is especially in undergrads, is cultivate this sense of you already have a sense of justice. So I don't think of the university as retraining camp. Like everything you've known prior to this is corrupt, and now that you're in my class, you're going to really know what justice is. If that's the case, then you just have to sort of, it's kind of like Plato's Republic, where he says to have a just society, you have to basically kill everybody over 10 because they're already corrupt. Which is not very promising. And it's been tried, and it doesn't really work that well.
Right.
So I assume that there's already, simply by being creatures of a good God, that there's already this formation that has taken place. And I want them to have students look at where it is they find those places and strengthen those places, cultivate those, love those places. So I do think justice has a virtue, never stands by itself. It's also related to being wise. It's related to being temperate, which is something we could use on the university campus, I'm sure you're very aware of.
We could, yes.
Temperance. Yeah. It's related to courage, knowing when to say the difficult thing in the right context and how to say it. But it's also related to love and to hope and to faith. So justice as a virtue is linked to all these other virtues. And how do you strengthen all of them? I think another thing that I try to do, and this is more at the graduate level, especially teaching seminarians, is to try to get students out of the bubble that we're in here, which is, it's a beautiful place, and I love the university, and we have we have a diversity of students, but to be a member of the university itself is already to be a certain kind of person. And one of the courses that I teach is on restorative justice. And we do a 12-week seminar with all men, who have just recently been released from incarceration. And part of that is to take students, and so the class is mixed with students from the seminary, student and the other students who are not getting any class credit from it, but they can do this as part of their rehabilitation. And they sit and they listen to each other's stories. They listen to how each other grew up, what they've had to confront and face, and how they own that, take accountability for that. Mm-hmm. And that class has been, I think, if there's any place where sort of the cultivation of the virtue of justice could take place, what it means, what it requires, how it's related to mercy, to forgiveness, to accountability, responsibility. That class does that quite well.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. You've given us a taste of thinking about justice, and I hope maybe we recruited you some students in this process. But this is a good example of what we'd like to try to do with these few conversations, helping us think about what justice means and how it plays out in our lives. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Steve, for the possibility.
Yeah.